They said they melted it down. The jeweler's ledger said otherwise. I want to start with that sentence, because for nearly 4 years, I believed a specific, confident claim made by my former mother-in-law about a ring that had belonged to my husband's family for 3 generations, a claim that convinced me, entirely, that a piece of jewelry carrying decades of family history no longer existed in any form I could ever hope to reclaim. I want to tell you exactly how I eventually learned this claim was never true, because I think, if you've ever trusted someone's confident explanation simply because questioning it felt like more conflict than you had energy left to manage, you already understand the particular quiet relief that comes from finally learning your instincts were right all along. Hello, and welcome. This is a quiet place for stories about the things we're told no longer exist, and the specific, undeniable records that sometimes prove otherwise, years after we thought a particular grief was already fully settled. If any part of this story feels familiar to you, I hope you'll stay until the end. My name is Nora. I am 34 years old, and 4 years ago, during the final difficult months of my divorce, my former mother-in-law asked me to return a family heirloom ring, telling me, several months later, that the ring had been melted down and its stones reset into an entirely new piece, a claim I believed completely until an unrelated visit to a jewelry appraiser recently revealed that this same ring had never been melted down at all. I want to tell you about the ring itself first, because understanding its actual history and significance matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. The ring had originally belonged to my former husband Michael's great-grandmother, a delicate three-stone setting featuring a modest center diamond flanked by two smaller sapphires. Crafted sometime in the early 1930s, according to the family stories Michael's mother Beatrice had told me repeatedly throughout our engagement and marriage. The ring had been passed down through 3 subsequent generations, given first to Michael's grandmother, then to his mother, and eventually when Michael proposed to me 6 years ago, Beatrice had formally ceremonially presented it to him to give to me, describing it, at the time, as a specific honor reserved only for the woman the family genuinely welcomed as a true permanent addition. I remember Beatrice telling me on several occasions throughout our early marriage the specific story of how the ring had survived considerable hardship over its nearly century-long history, carried carefully through a difficult wartime relocation by Michael's great-grandmother, protected through decades of modest family finances by choosing each generation to simply maintain rather than sell it even during genuinely difficult financial periods. I remember finding these stories genuinely moving, understanding even in those early years of our marriage that I was being entrusted with something considerably more significant than simply an attractive piece of jewelry, a physical thread connecting me to nearly a century of family resilience and careful, deliberate preservation. I want to describe the specific occasion when I first received this ring because I think understanding the genuine warmth and significance surrounding that original moment matters for understanding exactly how painful the eventual loss of the ring's true history would later become. Michael proposed to me at his parents' house during a family dinner that I later learned had been carefully orchestrated by Beatrice herself, who had spent weeks preparing a specific presentation of the ring's history before Michael formally offered it to me. I remember Beatrice's specific words that evening, holding my hands in hers, telling me that this ring represented the truest measure of family we have, and that she felt genuine certainty, watching Michael and me together, that I would carry this ring's legacy forward with the same care her own mother-in-law had once shown her. I remember that evening in considerable detail even now, the specific way Beatrice had arranged fresh flowers throughout the dining room, the old family photo album she'd set out on the side table, opened specifically to a black and white photograph of Michael's great-grandmother wearing the ring on her own wedding day decades earlier. I remember Michael's hands shaking slightly as he opened the small velvet box, and I remember the specific way the entire room seemed to hold its breath together. Michael's father setting down his wine glass, Beatrice's eyes already bright with tears, as though the whole family had been waiting, collectively, for this specific moment for considerably longer than just that particular evening. I want to be honest that I found this moment genuinely moving at the time, understanding it as a specific, meaningful gesture of acceptance into a family that had, throughout my relationship with Michael, generally treated me with warmth and genuine welcome. I wore that ring for the following 4 years of our engagement and marriage with considerable pride, understanding it as something considerably more significant than simply an attractive piece of jewelry. I want to tell you about how my marriage to Michael eventually ended. Because understanding the specific circumstances of our divorce matters for understanding exactly how the ring's return became entangled in a broader, more complicated family dynamic. Michael and I separated approximately 5 years into our marriage, a decision that emerged from a gradual, mutual recognition that we had grown into fundamentally different people than who we'd been when we first married, rather than any single dramatic betrayal or conflict. I want to be clear that our divorce, while genuinely painful, remained relatively amicable throughout most of its formal proceedings, both of us generally committed to handling our separation with as much mutual respect and fairness as the circumstances allowed. I remember the specific gradual quality of our marriage's decline, not a single dramatic rupture, but rather a slow accumulation of small, ordinary distances, differing career ambitions that pulled us toward increasingly separate daily lives, a shared understanding that eventually crystallized during a particularly honest conversation on a rainy Sunday afternoon, both of us acknowledging, gently and without significant anger, that we had simply become different people than the couple who'd stood together in that dining room years earlier. I remember feeling, throughout our separation process, a specific kind of grief that felt considerably quieter and more resigned than the more dramatic heartbreak I might have expected. Precisely because our ending, however sad, felt genuinely mutual and honest rather than born from any particular wrongdoing on either side. I want to tell you about the specific conversation where Beatrice first raised the question of the ring's return, because understanding the exact framing she used matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. Approximately 4 months into our formal divorce proceedings, Beatrice invited me to lunch, an invitation that struck me at the time as a genuinely kind gesture given the circumstances, an indication that whatever was happening between Michael and me, she wanted to maintain some continued warmth in our own separate relationship. During this lunch, she raised the question of the ring, explaining carefully and with what struck me as genuine thoughtful consideration that given the ring's specific significance as a family heirloom passed through Michael's direct lineage, she felt it would be appropriate, given our impending divorce, for the ring to return to the family's possession, to eventually be passed down to whichever family member's future marriage the family collectively felt honored this same tradition going forward. I remember that specific lunch clearly, a quiet restaurant Beatrice had chosen carefully, one we'd visited together several times over the years, a detail that felt, at the time, like a genuine gesture of continued warmth, rather than any deliberate strategy. I remember her hands folded carefully on the table as she raised the subject of the ring, her voice gentle but with a specific practiced quality that I now recognize, with the benefit of everything I've since learned, may have reflected considerably more preparation than the casual, spontaneous conversation it originally appeared to be. I want to describe my reaction to this request because I think understanding my genuine, thoughtful consideration of the situation, rather than any immediate emotional reaction, matters for understanding exactly why I ultimately agreed without significant resistance. I remember sitting with Beatrice's request for several days before responding, genuinely weighing what felt fair and appropriate given the specific circumstances. I understood, intellectually, that the ring represented a family legacy considerably older and more significant than my own 5-year marriage to Michael, and I felt at the time a genuine reluctance to create additional conflict during an already difficult period by insisting on keeping something that had never, in its deepest sense, been intended as simply my own personal property, but rather as a specific honor tied directly to my marriage to Michael himself. I want to be honest that some part of me, even then, felt a specific, quiet grief about returning the ring, understanding that whatever its origins, I had worn it for 6 meaningful years, and that its return represented, in a very tangible physical way, the formal ending of a relationship I had once believed would last considerably longer than it ultimately did. I remember specifically the several conversations I had with close friends during that same week, weighing out loud whether I was being genuinely generous or simply too conflict-averse to advocate properly for myself during an already exhausting period. One friend in particular gently suggested that I at least request some form of written acknowledgement regarding the ring's return, a suggestion I considered, but ultimately declined, trusting at the time that Beatrice's warmth and our years of genuine relationship made any such formal documentation feel unnecessary and, frankly, a little insulting to what I still believed was a foundation of mutual trust between us. I returned the ring to Beatrice approximately 2 weeks after our lunch conversation, meeting her briefly at her own house, a meeting that remained cordial and genuinely warm despite the emotional weight of what we were actually accomplishing. I remember her thanking me, specifically, for understanding the ring's significance and for handling its return with what she described as genuine grace, words that felt, at the time, like a meaningful, if bittersweet acknowledgement of the respect we had maintained toward each other throughout an otherwise difficult period. I remember the specific physical sensation of removing that ring for the final time, sitting in my car outside Beatrice's house beforehand, turning it slowly on my finger, feeling its familiar weight one last time before walking up to her front door. I remember Beatrice's hands, considerably steadier than mine, accepting the small velvet box I'd carefully prepared to return it in, and I remember the strange, hollow quiet of my own hand afterward, an absence I noticed for weeks following that visit, my thumb instinctively reaching for a ring that was simply no longer there. I want to tell you about the specific conversation where I first learned the ring had supposedly been melted down, because understanding exactly how this information reached me matters for everything that eventually unfolded. Approximately 8 months after returning the ring, I attended the wedding of a mutual friend, an event where I encountered several people connected to Michael's extended family, including his cousin, a woman named Jennifer who I had always maintained a friendly, if not particularly close relationship with throughout my marriage to Michael. During our conversation at this wedding, Jennifer mentioned, seemingly casually, that she had recently seen the new setting Beatrice had commissioned using the family's heirloom stones, describing a modern redesigned piece that Beatrice had apparently begun wearing herself on special occasions. I remember that specific wedding reception vividly, standing near the bar with a glass of wine I barely touched, Jennifer's comment arriving amid otherwise ordinary small talk about mutual acquaintances and shared memories from family gatherings years earlier. I remember the specific way my stomach tightened at her mention of the ring, an unexpected wave of grief I hadn't anticipated needing to manage at what was, otherwise, simply a pleasant social evening, and I remember excusing myself shortly afterward to find a quiet corner where I could process this news privately before rejoining the reception. I want to describe my reaction to learning this detail, because I think understanding the specific, gradual way this information unfolded matters for understanding exactly why I never thought to question its accuracy at the time. I asked Jennifer, with genuine, if somewhat painful curiosity, what exactly had happened to the original ring setting, and she explained, matter-of-factly, that Beatrice had decided the original setting, given its age and some minor wear, needed to be melted down and reworked into a more contemporary design, incorporating the same original stones into something she felt better suited her own current style and use. I want to be honest that I felt a specific sharp pain upon learning this detail, understanding that the specific ring I had worn for 6 years, in its original historic form, no longer existed in any recognizable way. A loss that felt, in that moment, considerably more final and complete than simply returning the ring itself had originally felt. I want to tell you about the following 4 years, because during this period, I simply accepted this explanation entirely, understanding the ring's original form as permanently gone, a closed chapter I gradually stopped thinking about as my own life moved forward into new relationships and experiences. I want to describe the specific circumstances that eventually led to this claim's true accuracy finally being questioned, because this discovery emerged, once again, almost entirely by accident, during a period when I had no particular reason to be investigating this specific history at all. Approximately 3 months ago, I brought several pieces of my own current jewelry to a well-regarded local appraiser for a routine insurance valuation update, a genuinely unrelated errand connected entirely to my own current life, rather than any lingering connection to my previous marriage. During this appointment, making ordinary conversation while the appraiser, a careful, experienced woman named Ms. Whitfield, examined my pieces, I mentioned somewhat in passing my previous marriage's family heirloom ring, describing its history and its eventual fate as simply an interesting, if personally painful, anecdote about family jewelry traditions. I remember Ms. Whitfield's small, well-organized office, natural light filtering through a large window behind her workbench, various pieces of jewelry laid out carefully on a soft cloth as she worked through my own collection methodically. I remember mentioning the ring's story almost as an afterthought, filling the comfortable silence while she examined a bracelet, genuinely surprised, in retrospect, at how easily this particular memory surfaced, given how thoroughly I believed I had already processed and released it years earlier. I want to describe Ms. Whitfield's reaction to this mention, because it represents the actual beginning of everything I eventually discovered. She asked me with genuine professional curiosity which jeweler had originally handled the ring's melting and reworking, explaining that this kind of specialized historical resetting work typically required a jeweler with specific expertise in antique piece restoration, a detail she seemed genuinely interested in given her own professional specialization in similar historical work. I told her honestly that I didn't actually know the specific jeweler involved, having learned about the ring's fate secondhand through Michael's cousin, rather than through any direct involvement in the process itself. Ms. Whitfield paused for a moment at this admission, her expression shifting into something I recognized, even then, as gentle, professional curiosity, rather than any particular suspicion. She mentioned that in her considerable years of experience, complete resetting work on antique pieces with documented multi-generational history often generated a specific kind of paper trail, appraisals, insurance updates, sometimes even photographs the family requested before altering something considered historically significant, precisely because families who genuinely valued a piece's history typically wanted that history properly documented before making any permanent, transformative change to its original form. I want to tell you about what happened next, because this conversation, seemingly minor at the time, eventually led me toward information that would fundamentally transform my understanding of everything that had happened 4 years earlier. Ms. Whitfield mentioned, somewhat offhandedly, that antique pieces with this kind of specific, documented multi-generational history sometimes carried considerable value beyond their simple material worth. Value that a family might have wanted properly documented before making any decision as significant as melting down and reworking such a historically significant piece. This comment, simple as it was, planted a specific, quiet seed of curiosity in me that I hadn't experienced in the 4 years since originally learning about the ring's supposed fate. I want to describe the specific decision I made following this conversation, because it represents the actual beginning of my own investigation into what had genuinely happened. I remembered, from my years of marriage to Michael, that his family had used the same jeweler for multiple generations, a small, well-established shop that Beatrice had mentioned, on several occasions throughout our marriage, as having serviced various family pieces for decades, including, I now recalled with growing curiosity, some of the original work on the ring itself years before I had ever entered the family. I remember, specifically, a conversation from early in my marriage when Beatrice had first mentioned this particular shop, describing how her own mother-in-law had first taken the ring there for a routine cleaning decades earlier, and how the shop's founder had personally handled the piece with what she'd described, at the time, as remarkable genuine reverence for its history, a detail she'd clearly found meaningful enough to repeat to me more than once over the years. I remember thinking, driving toward the shop that day, how strange it felt that a detail I'd absorbed so casually years earlier during a pleasant family conversation would eventually become the exact thread that unraveled everything I'd believed about the ring's more recent history. I decided somewhat impulsively to visit this specific shop directly, understanding that if the ring had genuinely been melted down and reworked, this longtime family jeweler would likely have been the one to handle such significant, historically sensitive work. I remember the specific drive to Hargrove Fine Jewelry, a modest shop I'd actually passed dozens of times during my marriage to Michael, without ever fully registering its significance. Tucked between a bakery and a small tailoring business in an older part of town that had largely resisted the newer, more commercial development spreading through the surrounding neighborhoods. I remember feeling a specific nervous uncertainty during that drive, genuinely unsure what I might discover, or whether this entire impulse might simply lead nowhere significant at all. A routine errand that happened to remind me of an old grief, rather than the beginning of any genuine revelation. I want to tell you about my visit to this jewelry shop, because what I discovered there fundamentally reorganized my understanding of everything that had happened over the preceding 4 years. The shop, a small, well-established business called Hargrove Fine Jewelry, had operated in the same location for over 60 years, currently run by the founder's grandson, a careful, thoughtful man named David Hargrove, who had inherited both the business and its meticulous, decades-long record-keeping practices from his own father and grandfather before him. I remember stepping into that shop for the first time, its worn wooden floors and glass display cases carrying the specific comfortable weight of genuine, sustained history, considerably different from the sleeker, more modern jewelry stores I typically visited for my own current needs. I remember a small brass bell announcing my entrance, and Mr. Hargrove looking up from a piece he was working on at his back workbench, his reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead, greeting me with the kind of unhurried, genuine attention that felt, immediately, like a shop that valued careful craftsmanship over rapid transaction. I want to describe the specific conversation I had with Mr. Hargrove, because his careful, thorough record-keeping practices ultimately provided the exact evidence that would prove decisive in everything I eventually discovered. I explained my connection to the ring, mentioning Beatrice's name and the ring's specific family history, and Mr. Hargrove, recognizing the family name immediately given their multi-generational relationship with his shop, offered to check his shop's historical records to see whether he could locate any information about the specific melting and resetting work I described. I remember him disappearing into a back room for what felt like a considerably long stretch of time, though it was likely only 15 or 20 minutes, returning with a large worn ledger book alongside a laptop displaying more recent digital records, explaining that his family's shop had maintained detailed service records for every single piece that passed through their doors, a practice his grandfather had established specifically to protect both the shop's reputation and their clients' historical pieces from exactly the kind of confusion or dispute that might otherwise arise decades later. I want to tell you about what Mr. Hargrove eventually found, because his shop's records revealed something entirely different from what I had believed for the previous 4 years. Mr. Hargrove's records, meticulously maintained across decades in a combination of digital and physical ledgers, showed no record whatsoever of the ring being brought in for melting or complete resetting during the specific time frame I described. Instead, his records showed only a single, routine service performed on the ring, a standard cleaning and prong tightening appointment, performed approximately 6 months after I had originally returned the ring to Beatrice, work considerably less significant than the complete melting and redesign Jennifer had described to me at that wedding years earlier. I remember Mr. Hargrove turning his laptop screen toward me, showing the specific digital entry, dated and itemized with the kind of careful professional precision that left little room for ambiguity or alternative interpretation. I remember reading the entry twice, my eyes moving slowly over words like routine cleaning and prong tightening 4 settings, rather than anything resembling the significant transformative resetting work I had believed had occurred. And I remember the specific physical sensation of my own understanding shifting, almost audibly beneath me. I want to describe my reaction to learning this information, because it represents a genuine disorienting recalibration of everything I had believed about this specific chapter of my own life. I sat in Mr. Hargrove's small shop, looking at his carefully maintained service record, a simple, unambiguous document showing routine maintenance rather than the dramatic, permanent transformation I had believed had occurred. And I felt a specific complicated mixture of relief and genuine anger. Relief that the ring's original historic form apparently still existed somewhere, and anger, slow building and increasingly sharp, at the specific deliberate deception this discovery suggested regarding what had actually happened to a piece of jewelry I had genuinely believed, for 4 full years, no longer existed in any recognizable form. I want to tell you about the specific steps I took following this discovery, because understanding exactly how I approached investigating this deception further matters for the eventual resolution of this entire story. I asked Mr. Hargrove whether his records indicated where the ring had ultimately been returned to following this routine service appointment, and he confirmed, checking his records further, that the ring had been picked up directly by Beatrice herself, with no indication in his records of any subsequent visit for the kind of significant resetting work I had originally been told had occurred. I remember Mr. Hargrove offering, kindly and without my even needing to ask, to print copies of these specific records for my own files, understanding, I think, from the particular quality of my reaction, that whatever I was navigating extended well beyond simple, idle curiosity about an old family piece. I remember thanking him, genuinely, for both his careful record-keeping and his quiet, unassuming kindness during what had turned into a considerably more emotional visit than either of us had anticipated when I'd first walked through his door that afternoon. I want to describe the specific emotional territory I navigated over the following several days, because I think understanding my genuine uncertainty about how to proceed matters for understanding the eventual, careful approach I ultimately chose. I want to be honest that my first instinct, in the raw days immediately following this discovery, involved a considerable amount of anger, understanding that Beatrice had apparently allowed me to believe, for 4 full years, that something I had genuinely cherished no longer existed, a belief that had allowed me to fully, completely release any lingering emotional or practical connection to the ring, precisely the outcome, I began to suspect, that Beatrice may have specifically intended to achieve. I remember those first several days vividly, replaying countless memories from my marriage through this new unsettling lens, wondering what other small kindnesses or explanations from Beatrice over the years might similarly deserve re-examination. A specific unsettling kind of retroactive doubt that I found genuinely exhausting to sit with. I called a close friend during this period, someone entirely outside the situation who could offer perspective uncomplicated by any connection to Michael's family. And I remember articulating, out loud for the first time, exactly how disorienting it felt to discover that 4 years of settled grief had apparently been built on an entirely false foundation. I want to tell you about the specific decision I eventually made regarding how to approach this situation, because I think the deliberate, careful path I chose matters considerably for understanding how this story eventually resolved. I decided against confronting Beatrice immediately, understanding that I wanted to gather additional, more complete information before initiating any direct conversation, particularly given how significantly her previous explanation had already proven inconsistent with the actual documented record. I want to tell you about the additional investigation I conducted, because the details I eventually uncovered painted a considerably more complete and more troubling picture than the simple discrepancy Mr. Hargrove's records alone had revealed. I reached out, carefully and diplomatically, to Jennifer, the same cousin who had originally told me about the ring's supposed melting and resetting, explaining that I had recently learned some information that seemed to contradict what she had told me years earlier, and asking whether she might recall more specifically where she had originally heard this information herself. I remember our conversation taking place over the phone, Jennifer's voice carrying genuine surprise as I explained what Mr. Hargrove's records had shown. And I remember her taking a long moment before responding, clearly working to recall a conversation from several years earlier that she likely hadn't thought much about since the original wedding where she'd first mentioned it to me. I want to describe Jennifer's response, because it revealed something I hadn't previously understood about how this particular piece of misinformation had originally spread through the family. Jennifer told me, somewhat apologetically, that she had never actually seen the reworked ring herself, and that her original comment to me at that wedding years earlier had simply repeated what Beatrice herself had told the broader family, a detail Jennifer had never had any specific reason to question or verify independently, given Beatrice's consistent, confident presentation of this explanation across numerous family gatherings and conversations over the preceding years. I want to tell you what this additional information suggested, because it indicated that Beatrice had not simply allowed a single, isolated misunderstanding to persist, but had actively, repeatedly presented this false explanation to multiple family members over an extended period, a pattern considerably more deliberate than any simple, one-time miscommunication. I want to tell you about the specific conversation I eventually had directly with Beatrice, because it represents, I think, the actual climax of this entire story. I contacted Beatrice approximately 3 weeks after my initial discovery at Mr. Hargrove's shop, requesting a meeting to discuss what I described only as some questions about the ring's history, deliberately not revealing in advance the full extent of what I had already learned. I want to describe that meeting carefully because the specific way it unfolded matters considerably for understanding the genuine complexity of what I eventually learned about Beatrice's actual motivations. We met at a quiet coffee shop, a neutral setting neither of us had any particular history with, and I began by asking her, directly but calmly, to describe again exactly what had happened to the ring following its return, giving her a full, genuine opportunity to offer her own account before I presented what I had already discovered. I remember that coffee shop clearly, a small corner table by the window, Beatrice arriving a few minutes early, already seated when I walked in, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she'd ordered but hadn't yet touched. I remember her posture, careful and composed, the same warm, confident demeanor I had known throughout my years in her family, giving no outward indication of the specific unraveling that was about to occur. I did not raise my voice through any part of this conversation. I had learned through everything this particular investigation had taught me that the truth, properly documented and calmly presented, rarely needs volume to be genuinely effective. Beatrice repeated initially the same explanation she had presumably given the broader family for years, describing the ring's melting and resetting into a new, contemporary piece she claimed to now wear regularly. I asked her at this point whether she would be willing to show me this reworked piece directly, a request that produced a long, telling silence before she finally haltingly admitted that she did not currently have any such piece to show me. I want to describe the specific moment Beatrice's explanation finally began to unravel, because it represents the actual turning point of this entire confrontation. I told her calmly about my visit to Mr. Hargrove's shop, about his careful records showing only a routine cleaning appointment, rather than any significant resetting work, and about his confirmation that she herself had picked up the ring following this simple, ordinary service. I watched her expression shift, gradually, from careful composure into something considerably more uncertain, and eventually, genuinely emotional. I want to tell you what Beatrice eventually admitted, because her explanation, once she finally offered it honestly, revealed a motivation considerably more complicated than simple calculated deception. She told me finally, with what struck me as genuine difficult honesty, that she had in fact kept the ring in its original form, storing it safely rather than reworking it in any way. She explained that in the months following our divorce, she had begun considering which future family member might eventually receive this same heirloom, and that she had specifically begun favoring the idea of eventually giving it to Michael's younger sister's daughter, her only granddaughter, understanding that this would keep the ring moving through the family's direct female lineage in a way that felt, to her, genuinely meaningful. I remember watching her hands, still wrapped around that now cold cup of tea, trembling slightly as she spoke, her voice dropping to something considerably quieter and more vulnerable than the confident, composed woman I had known throughout my marriage to Michael. I remember, too, feeling a strange, unexpected sympathy alongside my genuine anger, recognizing, even in that difficult moment, the particular vulnerability of watching someone you'd respected for years finally, reluctantly reveal something they'd clearly hoped would never need explaining. I want to tell you why Beatrice specifically chose to tell me the ring had been melted down, rather than simply explaining this alternative plan honestly, because her answer to this question revealed something genuinely uncomfortable about her own assumptions regarding my place within the family following the divorce. She told me, with visible difficulty, that she had worried, if I knew the ring still existed in its original form, I might eventually feel entitled to request its return, particularly if any future relationship or engagement of my own arose where I might want to reclaim some connection to this specific piece. She said she had decided at the time that the cleanest solution involved simply telling me the ring no longer existed, understanding that this would definitively close any possibility of future complication or conflict regarding an object she had already decided, privately, belonged exclusively to Michael's direct family line going forward. I remember asking her directly whether she had ever actually discussed this concern with me honestly, whether she had ever considered simply having the difficult, if potentially uncomfortable conversation about her genuine wishes for the ring's future, rather than manufacturing an elaborate fiction to avoid that conversation entirely. She was quiet for a long moment before admitting, with what I recognized as genuine, if belated self-awareness, that she had likely underestimated how reasonable and understanding I might have actually been if she had simply approached the situation honestly from the very beginning, rather than assuming I would respond with the kind of entitled possessiveness she had apparently, privately anticipated. I want to be honest with you about my reaction to this explanation, because I think it matters for understanding the genuinely complicated resolution this entire story eventually reached. I did not feel simple, uncomplicated anger upon hearing this explanation, though I want to acknowledge that anger was certainly part of my initial reaction. I felt instead something considerably more layered, understanding, gradually, that Beatrice's deception, however genuinely wrong and hurtful, had emerged from a specific, if misguided desire to avoid future conflict, rather than from any deliberate, malicious intent to cause me pain. I want to tell you about the specific resolution we eventually reached, because I think it represents a genuinely thoughtful, if imperfect, path toward addressing what had happened. I told Beatrice, directly, that I understood her underlying concern about future complications regarding the ring's ownership, but that her specific choice to deceive me, rather than simply having an honest, direct conversation, had caused genuine unnecessary pain, robbing me of the opportunity to process the ring's actual fate honestly, rather than grieving a fictional loss for 4 entirely unnecessary years. I remember watching her absorb this specific framing, understanding, I think for the first time, the actual distinction I was drawing between her underlying wishes regarding the ring's future, which I genuinely didn't object to, and her specific method of protecting those wishes, which had caused harm entirely separate from, and unnecessary to, the outcome she'd ultimately been trying to protect. I remember her nodding slowly, repeating back my own words as though testing their weight for herself, and I remember sensing, in that specific moment, that this distinction had genuinely landed with her in a way her earlier, more defensive explanations hadn't yet allowed. I want to tell you what I ultimately decided to request, because I think my specific choice here matters for understanding how I approached this resolution. I did not request the ring's return for myself. I want to be honest that this was a genuine, considered decision rather than any simple, automatic response. I understood, upon reflection, that my own 6 years of wearing the ring, meaningful as they had been, did not necessarily outweigh Beatrice's own multi-generational connection to this specific family heirloom, and I felt, genuinely, that continuing its journey through Michael's direct family line, as Beatrice had originally honestly intended before her decision to deceive me, remained a reasonable, appropriate path forward. I remember sitting with this decision for several days before formally communicating it to Beatrice, weighing genuinely competing feelings, a part of me that recognized I likely had some reasonable claim to at least discuss the ring's future, given my own years of stewardship, and a separate, ultimately more persuasive part of me that understood the actual harm I'd experienced had never truly been about losing physical possession of the ring itself. What had genuinely hurt was believing something precious no longer existed, being denied the simple dignity of an honest explanation, rather than any loss of the ring's material presence in my own jewelry box. Once I recognized this distinction clearly, the decision not to request its physical return felt considerably more straightforward than I initially expected it to. What I did request, instead, was simply the truth, formally and directly acknowledged, understanding that this acknowledgement mattered considerably more to me than reclaiming physical possession of the ring itself. I want to tell you about the specific conversation Beatrice and I eventually had with Michael, because I think including his perspective in this resolution mattered for ensuring the full, complete truth was finally, properly acknowledged within the broader family. I contacted Michael directly, explaining what I had discovered and what his mother had eventually admitted, and I want to tell you that his reaction, genuine surprise and discomfort regarding his own mother's deception, provided a specific, validating confirmation that I hadn't been alone in finding this situation genuinely troubling, regardless of how reasonable Beatrice's underlying concern about the ring's eventual ownership may have actually been. I remember that phone call with Michael clearly, our first real conversation in nearly a year, considerably more personal and vulnerable than the brief logistical exchanges that had characterized most of our communication since our divorce finalized. I remember him going quiet for a long moment after I explained what I'd discovered, and then saying with genuine audible discomfort, "That's not okay, Nora. I don't care what her reasoning was. That's just not okay." I remember feeling a specific, unexpected relief at hearing him say those words so directly, understanding that whatever complicated feelings remained between us regarding our own marriage's ending, we still shared, apparently, a fundamental agreement about the basic dishonesty of what his mother had chosen to do. Michael told me he intended to speak with Beatrice himself, separately, about this situation, and while I want to be honest, that I don't know the full details of whatever conversation eventually occurred between them, I do know that Beatrice reached out to me again approximately 2 weeks later, offering what struck me as a more complete, considered apology than the one she'd initially managed during our original conversation at the coffee shop. I want to be honest with you about how I feel now, several weeks removed from that difficult conversation with Beatrice. I do not feel simple, uncomplicated triumph, the way you might expect from a story that resolves this dramatically through documented proof of deception. I feel instead something considerably more complicated. A specific hard-won piece regarding a chapter of my own life I now understand considerably more, completely than I did 4 years earlier, alongside genuine ongoing sadness that someone I had once considered a genuine caring family member had chosen deception over the simple, if potentially uncomfortable, honesty our relationship had, I believed, once actually deserved. Beatrice reached out to me again, this second more considered apology I mentioned earlier, and we've since had 2 additional conversations, tentative and still finding their footing, that feel considerably more honest than anything we managed during my actual marriage to Michael. She told me, during our most recent conversation, that she planned to eventually explain the ring's true intended path to her granddaughter honestly, rather than continuing whatever careful narrative she had originally constructed. Understanding, I think, that the specific harm of her deception extended beyond simply what happened with me, into a broader pattern of managing family truth through careful, curated narrative, rather than genuine transparency. I remember her adding, near the end of that particular conversation, that this entire experience had prompted her to reconsider several other small, similarly curated explanations she'd offered various family members over the years, admissions she offered almost as an aside, but that struck me as evidence of a genuinely broader reckoning than I had originally anticipated this conversation might produce. I don't know, and likely never will, the full extent of whatever other small deceptions she may be reconsidering, but I choose to believe that this conversation prompted at least some meaningful, lasting reflection on her part, regardless of how imperfectly that reflection might ultimately translate into her future choices. I received, a few weeks after our final conversation, a small package from Beatrice, containing not the ring itself, but a photograph I had never seen before, an image of Michael's great-grandmother wearing the ring on her own wedding day, along with a handwritten note thanking me for handling the entire situation with more grace than she felt she deserved. I keep that photograph now in a small frame on my own dresser, understanding it as a specific, meaningful acknowledgement of a family history I remain genuinely connected to, regardless of how my own marriage into that family ultimately ended. I remember opening that package alone in my kitchen, genuinely surprised by its contents, having expected, if anything, simply another brief, careful message, rather than this specific considered gesture. I remember reading Beatrice's note twice, noting the particular care in her handwriting, considerably less composed and confident than the version of her handwriting I remembered from cards and notes throughout my marriage. Evidence, I think, of how genuinely this entire experience had affected her as well, regardless of how much responsibility for that difficulty rested squarely on her own original choice to deceive me. If there is one thing I want you to take from this story, it is this. A confident, detailed explanation is not the same thing as an accurate one, however genuinely we might want to trust the person offering it. I believed Beatrice's account of the ring's fate for 4 full years, not because the explanation itself was particularly convincing on its own merits, but because I trusted the person delivering it. A trust that, however reasonable given our previous relationship, ultimately obscured a considerably more complicated truth for far longer than necessary. Here is a second truth I have carried with me since that conversation. People sometimes choose deception not out of malice, but out of a genuine, if misguided desire to avoid future conflict they've already privately decided isn't worth navigating honestly. Understanding this distinction doesn't erase the genuine harm deception causes, but it does allow for a more complete, nuanced understanding of situations that might otherwise feel simply, purely adversarial. Here's a third truth. Documentation, once again, changes everything, even documentation as seemingly mundane as a jewelry shop's routine service records. I never imagined, walking into Mr. Hargrove's shop for an entirely unrelated reason, that a simple conversation would eventually unravel 4 years of genuine, deeply held belief about something I had already fully grieved and released. Here is a fourth truth. Vindication does not always require reclaiming what was originally lost. I chose not to request the ring's physical return, understanding that the resolution I genuinely needed involved acknowledgement and honesty rather than possession itself. I think this distinction matters considerably, recognizing that what we actually need from a resolved conflict isn't always the same as what we might have originally lost. Here is a fifth truth, one that surprised me most in the weeks following this entire experience. Choosing not to reclaim something you have every right to reclaim can be its own genuine form of strength, rather than any kind of passive acceptance or weakness. I spent considerable time worrying, in the days immediately following my discovery, that declining to request the ring's return might somehow suggest I didn't take Beatrice's deception seriously enough. I understand now, with the clarity of some distance, that choosing the resolution that genuinely served my own healing, rather than the resolution that might have felt most immediately satisfying, required its own specific, deliberate kind of courage. And here is the last truth I want to leave you with. Sometimes the things we believe we've fully grieved and released still carry unresolved questions beneath the surface. Questions that, once finally answered, however unexpectedly, can offer a specific, genuine peace we didn't fully realize we were still missing. I had believed for 4 years that I had made complete peace with the ring's supposed loss. Learning the actual truth, however complicated and imperfect its resolution ultimately proved, gave me a considerably more genuine, complete peace than the fictional closure I had unknowingly been carrying instead. That is my story. 4 years of believing a confident false explanation, one unrelated visit to a careful jeweler, and one meticulously maintained shop ledger that finally revealed exactly what had actually happened to a ring I had genuinely believed no longer existed. I think sometimes about that specific evening years earlier, sitting in Michael's parents' dining room, watching him open that small velvet box while his entire family held its collective breath together. I don't regret that memory. Even now, even knowing everything I've since learned about how the ring's actual story eventually unfolded. I think it's possible to hold multiple truths simultaneously. That a moment can be genuinely, completely meaningful in the exact instant it occurs. And that the people who create that meaning can still, years later, make choices that complicate or even damage the trust that moment was originally built upon. I choose now to hold on to the genuine warmth of that original evening, understanding it as something separate and distinct from whatever complicated choices followed years afterward. I keep that small framed photograph Beatrice eventually sent me, Michael's great-grandmother in her own wedding portrait, on my dresser still. A quiet physical reminder that family history, however complicated its more recent chapters sometimes become, remains genuinely worth honoring, in whatever form that honoring ultimately takes. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that the confident explanations we accept without question sometimes deserve more scrutiny than we initially give them, I would love to hear from you. Tell me, in your own words, about a time you eventually discovered that something you'd fully grieved and released had actually never been lost the way you were originally told. If this helped you tonight, a simple like lets me know these stories are genuinely worth continuing to tell. Thank you for spending this time with me. I will see you in the next story. Before you go, I want to leave you with one final thought. Truth, once it finally surfaces, tends to arrive in its own time, on its own schedule, often through the most ordinary, unremarkable circumstances, rather than any dramatic confrontation we might have imagined. I never once suspected that a routine insurance appointment would eventually unravel 4 years of settled, mistaken grief. I think that's worth remembering, the next time something in your own life quietly, unexpectedly refuses to add up the way you'd long assumed it did.